Welcome to this presentation on policy and practice and how metacognition can be used to improve the reading comprehension of deaf students. The aim of this presentation is to explore how deaf students' reading comprehension has a wide-ranging impact on barriers to learning and how some of these barriers might be removed by using metacognition as a strategy. We will do this by looking at policy, as the SEND Code of Practice requires us to work towards removing these barriers, and the Equality Act of 2010 requires schools to make reasonable adjustments, and this involves making changes to school policies where necessary to make sure our students are neither directly nor indirectly discriminated against. Therefore, in this session, we will be exploring the impact of current policy and practice, as well as using the graduated approach of assess, plan, do, review in order to introduce metacognition as a tool with which we might improve reading comprehension for our deaf learners. The rationale is therefore that there is a clear and consistent gap in literacy skills between deaf children and their hearing peers, and if we have a better understanding of when reading comprehension breaks down for our deaf students, the strategies we can teach them to use should have a significant impact and should become easier to embed in our practice. This begs the question as to why there is a significant difference between deaf learners and their hearing peers in terms of literacy outcomes. So we will be looking at the current picture of literacy outcomes, the school literacy policy, government policy, assess what could be changed, plan how we can introduce metacognitive techniques, look at what good practice might look like, and review further steps. We will now look at why deaf students still underperform in relation to their hearing peers. We know that literacy outcomes for deaf children still lag significantly behind hearing peers. This seems to be borne out across languages, and even though there have been improvements with early intervention and advanced technology, it is still an area of difficulty. As deaf students do not form a homogeneous group, various possible reasons affecting achievement are the age of identification of deafness, early identification leading to better outcomes, the age when hearing technology is fitted and if it is used consistently, socio-economic background of the student, exposure to language, and the size of a child's vocabulary. As research has not led to any significant improvement by narrowing the gap between literacy skills of hearing peers, this leads Marshak et al. To state that it is an overriding concern for teachers of the deaf. The attainment gap widens as students progress through the key stages, reflecting the increasing demands of the curriculum. Hutchinson points to a lack of analysis of the stories of deaf children, and this means we have less of an understanding of how other factors such as socio-economic background and other learning difficulties affect attainment. She states that access to specialist teachers of the deaf may be necessary, but it is not on its own a sufficient and reasonable adjustment. We know that deaf students also tend to overestimate their performance. Arguably, it might be that we need to understand what barriers affect comprehension before we can put effective interventions in place. Therefore, the focus on building vocabulary is of course worthwhile, although it may not be sufficient in developing deaf students' reading comprehension. As we will see, the Equality Act of 2020 requires schools to make reasonable adjustments to reduce disadvantages for disabled pupils, and narrowing this gap relies on deaf students being better at reading comprehension. We will now look at what research tells us about the impact of a child's vocabulary on reading comprehension. The importance of vocabulary. A large amount of our students' learning in the classroom is expected to come from successful text comprehension, and therefore their ability to decode a text is seen as essential, and focus on interventions are often based on creating a vocabulary-rich environment. The GL assessment paper Read All About It from 2020 highlights the correlation between good performance in all subjects, not just those considered to be more text-heavy, with a child's reading ability. It details 3 successful school-based interventions focusing on teaching vocabulary. While vocabulary size undoubtedly is a significant part of reading ability, and it is a strong predictor of reading comprehension, it is not all that is required. Decoding needs to be automatic, freeing up cognitive load for other skills involved, such as background knowledge. According to Lederberg et al., we know that phonological knowledge is an important predictor of reading ability, but even more strongly predictive are vocabulary and syntactic abilities. And research suggests that deaf children's reading comprehension skills are not in line with what would be expected from their ability at word reading level. For Jan and Paul, there is a strong element of language skills and reading ability predicting academic achievement for both hearing and deaf children. And the gap in attainment could be because of deaf students' poorer understanding and poorer use of inference. In researching into how deaf learners acquire new knowledge of new words, Pinnis asks us to consider the process. We know that for hearing peers, it is contextual exposure, and key to this is integration skills, which means connecting various parts of information together. She suggests that it may not be deaf learners' lack of ability to use these integration skills, rather than being able to do so spontaneously and without direction. Therefore, we will look at what strategies we are currently using and which are effective in improving a deaf child's literacy in school, and does current policy and practice help to remove barriers to learning? Current policy in my setting. While current policy in my setting does not specifically address reading comprehension, it is, however, clear on the need to develop students' literacy. It would seem that GCSE exams are pitched at the right level in terms of reading age. Therefore, for students to successfully access tests, a reading age of 15 plus is most likely needed. There is a significant number of students whose reading age is at least 2 years below their chronological age. For example, in Year 7, 23 students have a reading age of 2 or more years below, and in Year 8, this is 30 students. Rosenshine's 10 principles of instructions are being used to improve literacy and guide students through the learning process. Of particular importance for reading comprehension are asking questions, guiding student practice, and checking students' understanding. Using the Assess, Plan, Do, Review cycle detailed in the SEND Code of Practice, as a school we have implemented literacy interventions which focus on a whole text approach, using background knowledge and a talk aloud strategy where the teacher explains to the class what they are doing before, during and after reading a text. This is scaffolding according to number 8 of the principles, and a temporary support and a form of guided practice. Therefore, we are modelling and teaching metacognition to our students, but not explicitly labelling it as such. However, the school's SEND policy only has one mention of literacy as a trigger for intervention when a student shows significant difficulty in developing literacy skills. One of the aims of the school's accessibility plan is to improve the delivery of information to pupils with a disability, and some of the ways this already happens are internal signage, large print resources, use of the Soundfield system, CSWs for deaf students whose first language is BSL, and use of sign-supported English if appropriate. The aim is to reduce and eliminate barriers which restrict pupils' access to the curriculum and participation in the school community. We will now look at current legislation which is relevant now but may be updated or changed in the coming months. 3 important pieces of legislation that must inform our practice when working with deaf students are 1. The SEND Code of Practice, 2. The Equality Act of 2010, and 3. Children's and Families Act, Part 3. One of the principles of the SEND Code of Practice, according to Philippa Stobbs, is that the essence of reasonable adjustments is that they anticipate where disadvantage may arise and are put in place to prevent or limit that happening. In addition, there must be a focus on inclusive practice and removing barriers to learning, and in terms of curriculum, lessons should be planned to address potential areas of difficulty and to remove barriers to pupil achievement. NatSIPs, a guide for those working with learners with sensory impairment, provides some examples of reasonable adjustments to the curriculum. Those relevant to deaf students include the use of subtitles for video clips, modifying language of written material, using modified teaching strategies. Equally, NatSIP's Equality Act advice for schools states that we should be supporting children and young people's development and helping them to achieve the best possible educational and other outcomes. The Children and Families Act equally makes the assumption that children with an EHCP will be educated in a mainstream setting, which means we need to take active measures to remove barriers to learning. The SEND Code of Practice recommends using the graduated approach of assess, plan, do, review for support that is put in place. To begin this process, we will start with a definition of metacognition. Barker and Brown's definition is of knowledge about cognition and regulation of cognition, which in more student-friendly language could be said to be thinking about thinking. It begins with thinking about what you do as you read, and to do so you need to be a fluent reader or comprehension becomes problematic, and we are using working memory for decoding instead of comprehending. Does the literacy policy meet current guidance? Clearly, students need to be fluent decoders before using metacognitive strategies. However, as we have seen, we need to be aware that the barriers faced by our deaf students may not be solely predicted from their word reading ability. The English department is using more information texts in lessons to redress the balance, as students are much more likely to encounter narrative texts in class. As students are less familiar with information texts, as a consequence they are less able to make sense of them. Furthermore, as it is more likely that these texts will also be those most frequently encountered in adult life, as Lissy et al. State, this has implications far beyond academic achievement. By improving access to written text, we are helping to remove unforeseen barriers in the future. This matters because it is at the heart of what inclusive practice should be, and what we should be aiming for. Levesque states that placing young deaf learners at the centre of these policies and learning from the wisdom of their experiences will in turn help to guide the policies and practices that form the foundation of their education and will maximise outcomes. On the right is a brief reminder from Goff and Tunmer's model of the simple view of reading. We know that good comprehension depends on good word reading. However, we know that the rate of vocabulary acquisition for deaf learners is slower than for hearing peers. Research into how deaf readers monitor their own comprehension has not developed significantly in the last 20 years, particularly for non-fiction texts. We know that deaf children are not exposed to the same amount of oral language, and this impacts on their comprehension of written texts. Jan and Paul state that there is a strong positive relationship between metacognitive skills and reading comprehension, and in a research paper in 2021 confirmed evidence that Strassman has said is the oft-repeated one, that comprehension monitoring skills of deaf students remain inadequate. They state that the students are not aware of effective metacognitive strategies and in general do not know what they do not know. However, learning strategies used before and during reading can help to remove barriers to understanding a text. Aside from focusing on the need to improve deaf students' metacognition, we should reflect on how this can be done. Teaching and reflecting on the process of comprehension should help to demystify the process, but also we need to teach students not only how to use metacognitive strategies, but also when to use them. We know that we need to be fluent readers in order to comprehend a text, and this means we decode words automatically, apply background knowledge, and monitor our own understanding. According to the DFE's The Reading Framework, as fluent readers, we generate inferences and hypotheses, constantly predicting what may be coming next. We draw on what we already know and adjust our ideas as we absorb new information. Knowledge, both from our reading and from real life, feeds into this new reading. If we forget what has just happened or want to check something, our eyes flip back quickly to pick up the information we need. The framework addresses the question of whether comprehension can be taught by explicitly stating that comprehension is an outcome and therefore not a skill that can be taught separately. This does not mean, however, that strategies which monitor comprehension should not be used. We can help students with constructing a mental model of a text, which includes background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, and expectations from the structure of the text as well as inferencing. Furthermore, good monitoring correlates closely with good comprehension. The plan of how to teach metacognition. Over a 6-week period, I will introduce metacognitive strategies for our deaf students to use when reading texts. The techniques of metacognition can be thought of as belonging to 3 main categories: 1. Planning, 2. Monitoring, 3. Evaluating. And we will focus on developing students' awareness and monitoring of their own comprehension. It is likely that improvements in these areas can be made by highlighting them to students, as some strategies are already being used but not explicitly labelled as metacognitive strategies. If the integration of background or prior knowledge is simply not taking place, we need to encourage students to ask themselves, what do I already know about this subject? It needs to be habit forming, and therefore students need sufficient practice after being taught the reading strategies so that they can do so independently. We have 2 targets of teachers using planning strategies before reading, which will involve discussing background knowledge, and students will use self-monitoring techniques including predicting, questioning, and summarizing. Teaching will focus on how to use your own knowledge to help make sense of a text, and how to monitor your own comprehension, and what to do if you don't understand. How will this be done? Rosenshine states that effective teachers teach comprehension strategies by providing students with prompts that they could use to help them reflect on their understanding of a passage. Prompts can be simple, such as who, where, why, and how, but what is important is that the teacher models how to use these words to ask questions, and this is followed by guided practice where students are helped to create their own questions, and then finally supervised independent practice. The examples we see here of metacognitive question cards can be used to prompt deaf learners to use certain strategies such as looking back, rereading, and making connections. When comprehension breaks down, deaf students should be encouraged to use these strategies as they may not do so spontaneously or independently. This example of a cue card here can help with comprehension monitoring, which is something that Jan and Paul strongly recommend is taught explicitly to deaf learners. It is necessary to teach students to use these because if we don't, they may use strategies that are not conducive to better comprehension. Next, we would review the intervention. By removing barriers to learning, our deaf students should be better engaged with a range of texts, able to read for extended periods of time, and become more independent in their reading. Progress can be measured through improved reading ages and the impact that this should have on all areas of the curriculum. There is also some inclusion of student voice, and this also meets number 5.18 of the mandatory qualifications for teachers of the deaf in encouraging deaf learners to develop their thinking skills and independence. Next steps. It does seem that good reading comprehension has much in common for deaf and hearing learners, while there may be still differences in the strategies that they use. We need a better understanding of what strategies are used by deaf students with good comprehension skills, and this could be done by using reflective questionnaires with them. We should also include student voice more, as studies focus more on where difficulties lie, rather than asking students themselves what specific difficulties they experience. In conclusion, by using metacognition as a strategy, not only should we be able to remove some of the barriers to learning, it might also reveal for the students themselves and for us other areas where deaf students have specific difficulties with reading comprehension. This can be done by regularly reviewing the school's literacy and other policies and making sure that we are always working towards removing barriers to learning.